things to do functional integration. And sometimes people do free weights, but then they actually in a cable work where they can use axial movement along with the strengthening they build up. So there's lots of useful things to do in terms of reconditioning programs for strength. But we need to put lots of functional things in to strengthening and reconditioning. One of the things that we recognise from the low threshold stuff nowadays is the pattern training. In your functional movements, you can't find a functional movement that changes the pattern. You use whatever pattern you have in all of your functional movements. Okay, it's sort of pre-programmed in. And that's why we have to do non-functional, cognitive things to change the patterns. To change sequencing, to change threshold, to change timing. Because functional movements don't change timing and sequencing because that's built in, that's automatic in the background of every functional movement you do. Okay. So we need to do these non-functional things, but by the time you've changed the patterns, you use whatever pattern you have in your functional movements. So maintenance work is not such a big thing to do so long as you've got it right. So we just check a couple of times a week. Okay? Yeah, we don't need to do a lot of functional integration because every functional movement you do is already integrating it. Once it feels easy, looks easy, you're using those patterns in the background of your functional movements. One of the problems is that the way we've been brought up on the physiology of strengthening weak muscles. And so we've been all brought up on adding load as a progression, doing functional things as progressions, and that's valid for high threshold strength training. It is not valid for motor control threshold training. But we weren't taught when we all trained the physiology of threshold, the physiology of how patterns work automatically in the background of functional activities we do. And so we haven't been taught that the idea of changing thresholds, okay, is the patterns, and you use whatever threshold pattern you have in the background of all your functional activities. So once you've fixed it, you almost don't have to do any maintenance work. But it's good to check that it still feels familiar. Okay? But if it's not familiar, then you need to do a little bit of stimulation of the central nervous system with sensory motor links you want to make rather than motor output links you want to make for threshold training.
So you find that by changing the pattern and activating the correct sequence, then people can add load and not get into trouble.
Yeah, because they use that pattern under load too. Load is a progression of force. But whatever pattern you use in low load, you also use the same patterns in high load. You just use more force contraction, but the pattern is the same. Now, remember we talked about low load exercises uses stabilizer dominant patterns, and as you go to high load, you use mobilizer dominant patterns. That's automatic. That'll carry over. So we'll still see that we're mobilizer dominant for high load activities. Okay. But the problem that's been shown from the research that linked to recurrence is the low threshold patterns. And so adding load is not a progression of that. Adding load is a shift to a mobilizer dominant pattern. But that's normal for high load. So it is not an appropriate progression to add resistance training to these exercises as a progression of threshold training. If you want, you can add resistance training to these exercises to strengthen the muscles you've trained. But once you add resistance training to this, you're going to shift into more mobilizer dominant and stabilizer co-contraction patterns, which is appropriate for high load function. And you'll build up bulk if you've had some disuse atrophy. So that's still not an appropriate thing to do for people who are weak. But adding resistive loads as a progression of threshold training, okay, is not a progression of threshold training, it's changing you to a different training process. Okay, it's like turning left into a different street. You're not in the same street anymore. You're not in the same suburb anymore. You've gone somewhere else. You're visiting a new city. Okay? It's a different place. But one of the mentalities we all have as therapists, because of the way we were taught physiology, is you progress weak muscles and make them stronger by adding load as a progression. And that is valid for weakness. But it's not valid for timing and coordination and threshold issues. Adding load will shift you back to mobilizer dominant patterns, which are appropriate for load. Okay. So pattern training, we want to stay in the low threshold range. How do we add progressions to threshold training programs? Little tip. Take load away. Take feedback away. Get off the wall and rely on your own sensory system to give you feedback. That's a progression. But that's why the tests are often unsupported, and we use load and support and feedback as a starting point. But another way to progress it, once you've got the unsupported control back, is to work with an unstable base. To work within a non-fatiguing, non-predictable, proprioceptive challenge. So sitting on, what do you call them in this country? In Australia they're Duradiscs, in Europe they're sit-fits, the little inflatable disc. Dynadiscs, yeah. Stand or sit on a dynadisc while you do some of these little exercises, while you do some of the little association drills. Okay, weight bear that elbow on a dynadisc while you do that arm lift or the side bridge. Add a non-fatiguing proprioceptive challenge, but the dynadiscs are non-predictable. Okay, don't make them so hard you fall off, or so hard you fatigue. If you have to work so hard, if you have to co-contract so hard to stop falling off, you're fatiguing, then make it easier. Use an AirX mat, not a dynadisc. Use a proprioceptive challenge that is non-fatiguing. It's very important though, because otherwise you go into high threshold training, strength training. So there's gym ball exercises that are hard work and gym ball exercises that are easy. Do the easy end. Okay, so that's not fatiguing but non-predictable. So the way to progress motor control threshold training is to do the same pattern but impose a low force, non-fatiguing, non-predictable proprioceptive challenge.